At this point, we're all very familiar with the modern-day reemergence of the once-dead survival horror genre, and I'd like to think it's because I've covered my fair share of them here on this channel. Games like You Will Die Here Tonight, Alyssa, Signalis, and Crow Country, all of them incredibly solid showings, but there's been one that's been camped out in a little spot in the back of my head for a while now. A pretty small indie title that I've been following very closely for what seems like years. I got my first taste of CONSCRIPT when its demo dropped, and I included it in my Modern RE Clone series, and ever since then I have been wildly excited for its full retail release, and well, that day is finally upon us. Or it was, depending on how long it takes me to get this out. But it's not important right now for us to talk about my impressive history of always being late to everything. What is, though, is that we stop with the pleasantries and jump into one of the most imaginative and bleakly dark survival horror games to come out of this whole genre revival thing. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. CONSCRIPT is a modern survival horror game published by Team 17 and solely developed by a single guy. This guy, to be precise, Jordan Mochi. Now, a single person churning all of this out is, to be honest, baffling, but more important than who made it is what inspired it. As you may or may not have noticed, this game is set smack dab in the middle of World War I, still one of the largest conflicts in terms of loss of human life in world history. So in terms of uniqueness and novelty, we've already got something that gives it a wild advantage over its genre peers, and we haven't even actually discussed anything outside of its setting yet. But before we move on to the actual video, just for transparency's sake, I do want to mention that this game was given to me free of charge by either Jordan or Team 17. I honestly forgot which one messaged me. But that being said, there was no expectation of any specific outcome, no money changed hands, and I can assure you I will be extra critical. And with that out of the way, let's talk story. With a conflict as bloody and serious as the First World War, writing a story inside of its events, I imagine, is a pretty daunting task. I mean, not only do you want to do justice to the sheer gravity of the event, but you're also going to want to tell a story that hasn't already been told. I mean, there are people who casually devote their entire lives to following the events of this tragedy. Hell, one of them made this game. So retelling the tale of events so well known they're written down in your high school history book probably wasn't going to be fulfilling for either the game's developer or its players. Which is why I'm really glad that Jordan took the direction that he did. In CONSCRIPT, you play as Andre, a regular French guy who was conscripted into the war machine along with his brother Pierre. The game begins with Andre waking up just a few moments before the Battle of Verdun. According to the soldiers still in the trenches, he just missed his brother's regiment getting the order to meet the German threat, so worried about his sibling and not wanting to catch a bullet for desertion, we get our gear sorted and hop on the good foot after him. And that earlier little tidbit is kind of important. Soldiers getting scared and running off is a major issue in any war, but French COs were apparently pretty notorious for executing anyone found to be in direct conflict with an order just to make an example that desertion would not be tolerated. Something you might want to keep in mind from this point on because it can play a major role in how events turn out with your playthrough. Anyways, it seems like while Andre was sleeping, portions of the German army had made it into some areas of the base, and when he does come across Pierre, it looks like he was on the receiving end of one hell of a beating. But there are two positives here. One, he got the guy that got him, and two, Pierre doesn't seem to be at death's door right now. Wanting to take care of his brother does sort of come into conflict with the harsh penalties for not obeying orders or being seen as fleeing from a fight, so with that in mind we rush off to take part in the battle, and the results are expectedly brutal given the circumstances. Bullets and bombs are dropping all around Andre, and subsequently so are his countrymen. And I've really gotta say, Jordan did an incredible job of showcasing the chaos of armed conflict, especially the kind where firearm tech at the time kept fights relatively close quarters compared to today. As we approach the skirmish, the opposing forces start pouring into the trenches like ants, and even though you've got fellow soldiers all around you, everyone's engaged in some kind of struggle of their own, meaning it's basically every man for himself. Which in my case turned out to be one of those, I'm not locked in here with you guys are locked in here with me kind of situations. But just as the French forces, or more specifically Andre, begins to build a little momentum, the whole area gets gassed, forcing him to head for cover and cleaner air. In the process, we make our way back to Pierre, and by the time Andre gets back to where he was, he seems to have either left on his own or was potentially taken somewhere. In his place, we find a letter letting us know that the Germans have taken the fort and that everyone's to retreat to Fort Saint Michel. Oh, and now's probably a good time to admit that I have literally no experience pronouncing French words or terminology, so if I am saying anything profoundly wrong, don't worry, it's gonna continue for the entire video. Anyways, it sounds like we need to get a move on because this letter mentions specifically that any injured are to be taken to the med bay to either be killed by the invading Germans or become their prisoners of war. Seems like an easy enough task, just grab your brother and join the retreat. I mean, I can't foresee anything horribly going wrong, let's say just outside this room. Sometime later, Andre wakes up in a room the Germans were using as a dead body storage, and from here the goal is to link back up with your unit and, of course, track down your brother. And this is where I have to be honest and say that this game doesn't necessarily have a story in the traditional sense. I mean, your main character has a past, a goal, and finds himself caught up in all kinds of story-like events, but beyond the search for his brother and a handful of flashbacks to his life before being conscripted, there really isn't a lot of your average narrative threads to get caught on here. And I really don't want that to come across like an insult, because in the context of this game, I think that was the right move. As you play, you get to interact with a few reoccurring characters and find some info on the potential whereabouts of your brother, but for almost the entire experience, the spotlight stays on Andre's current situation and its very small place in the greater scale of the massive war that has chewed up so much of the French countryside. I mean, it almost feels appropriately simplistic. Like, we aren't expecting this guy to go through some kind of a traditional character arc while he's locked in a constant life or death struggle with an army that vastly outnumbers him. I sort of feel like with the crushing force of this larger conflict going on, there's not really any room for some kind of personal affirmation tale. Andre is a single lowly soldier in a war that he wants no part in, and he's got two goals: keep breathing and find his brother, which, at least in this situation, is really all that's necessary. In the process of fighting to meet back up with this squad, we'll come across a good number of micro-stories in the form of diary entries and letters chronicling the time before the recent German raid, and honestly, it's exactly as bleak as you would expect for events taking place in a World War I trench. People are describing the process of dealing with mass graves, missing their loved ones, a prevalence of poison gas injuries, and the overall psychological rigors of armed conflict. Once again, though, these are far off in the periphery. The main character in this story is always the war itself, and I found that to be an incredibly effective way to tell this tale. Instead of zooming out and witnessing the events of this war as a series of battles on a grand scale, we get right in on the ground level and follow a single French soldier as he deals with what seems like the most significant thing that could possibly ever happen to somebody, but in reality, this is just a night or two in a war that lasted 4 years. I mean, realistically, I would imagine there were tens of thousands of these same scenarios playing themselves out on both sides of the conflict. And since there isn't as much time spent on regular old exposition, a lot of that effort went into an absolute ocean's worth of environmental storytelling. Every single inch of mud or charred ground that Andre steps foot on seems to tell a story. You can really feel the dwindling condition of these trenches, what it must have been like eating, sleeping, and more often than not dying here. And likewise, you feel a genuine sense of invasion when the place gets flooded by enemies. Even when you leave those trenches and head out into what used to be farmland, you can see the corpses of livestock or French horses caught up in the bombings and gas attacks. Moving forward into a village, you can feel the weight of what happened here, and coming across letters and journals written by the one-time inhabitants show a kind of unknowing chaos falling over the place. Will the French forces push back the approaching Germans before they get a chance to get to the village? Should we pack our things in jet? And how do we get in contact with family members who may have been away before all of this started? All of this really had an effect on me. I can only really describe it as the kind of feeling you get when watching some on-the-ground reporting from a deadly conflict. You can see the human suffering as if it were pressed into the very fiber of the environment. Truly powerful stuff. And speaking of powerful, this is something that took me a while to notice when I first played the demo, but it was a point that was driven home all over again with this latest playthrough. I think this might be the very first horror game I've ever played without a single solitary sci-fi or supernatural element to speak of. No aliens, magic powers, revived corpses feasting on the living. It's just the terrifying reality of war. I mean, to be fair, the German soldiers' almost mechanical look or the scary as hell sound of their gas mask-aided breathing somewhere down a dark tunnel might do a lot to elevate them to an arena almost adjacent to science fiction, but I mean, all of this stuff is accurate and can be found in the real-world conflict. And I think that's what makes all of this so effectively impactful. You're never really taken out of the reality of World War I, and since it's already set in one of the absolute most terrifying scenarios known to man, it doesn't really need anything extra. On top of that, it's chronicling one of the war's bloodiest battles. Placing an avatar of the player smack dab in the middle of all of that is enough horror to fill an entire franchise of these sort of games. Even though I've already talked about how there isn't as much content here story-wise, there are still a lot of elements that would lose their narrative weight if I just blurted them out to you. So if you are planning on checking out CONSCRIPT, which I 100% suggest you do, skip past the chapter mark spoilers or to the timestamp on screen. I mean it, no cheating. I actually can tell who does and does not skip past that stuff. Don't tell anybody, but no, I can't. Now, it's worth pointing out that CONSCRIPT has a few different endings, and I kind of stupidly got what I would assume is one of the worst ones, but I did want to take a moment to mention how effectively it got under my skin and honestly might be one of the best video game endings I've ever seen before. After fighting through an absolutely chadly 15.5 hours of pure survival horror attrition, Andre finally comes across his brother at the bottom of a pit meant for corpses underneath a German stronghold. And once again, even though he does want to get him the hell out of there, he has to push back the nearly endless army descending upon the fort. So our guy takes up arms and single-handedly goes head-to-head with what feels like the full brunt of the German war machine. These guys start just flooding over the barricades, and as I'm quite genuinely fighting for my life against what appears to be unwinnable odds, my wife happens to walk past the room, and we're both kind of marveling at some of the cool stuff I'm pulling off, sort of basking in the video gaminess of it all. But then something weird happened. All of a sudden, the mood just totally shifted. Replacing the appropriately more up-tempo, percussion-heavy string accompaniment that perfectly matched the chaos taking place on screen was this somber, slow piano lick. We both immediately took note of it, and it led to this wild moment where her and I both went from having fun to lamenting all of the death and destruction. This one little change to the fight turned it from set piece to survival. It was like even the game was expecting Andre to fail, and even if he did end up winning, what was going to be his prize? A mountain of corpses that used to be his fellow humans and the lifetime of mental baggage that would entail? It was genuinely emotional. And you know, at the time, I figured we'd experienced the apex of what this game had to offer, but then I returned to the badly wounded Pierre and carried him slowly and painstakingly all the way through the fort into a nearby medic tent. Now, Andre, obviously having gone through hell to get to this point, was just at the very limits of what his body could take, so as they both collapse, the last thing he gets to see just before he loses consciousness is his brother's lifeless body. It was a soberingly somber moment, one only topped when Andre opens his eyes to find himself tied to a stake, ready to be summarily executed for abandoning his post and orders to save his brother. This guy risked life and limb to get to Pierre, and when he finally did, he wasn't only met with his death, but to make it all the more fruitless, the last thing he got to hear in this world was accusations of cowardice and several rifles going off. And the last thing we're left with is a slow zoom on a picture of who I assume to be Andre and Pierre's mother, while the game lets us know about how bloody of a conflict this battle really was. I turned to look at my wife just to share the absolute gut punch that was, and she was already in the process of wiping tears from her eyes. It was truly something magical. I mean, I had invested almost 20 hours into this game if you count all the restarts I did, and she had only just walked in for maybe the last 20 minutes of it, and we were both a damn mess. I'm gonna level with you guys. I didn't really have anything I wanted to add to this or any sort of analysis for it. I put up that spoiler warning just to share this experience with somebody because I think it ended up being one of, if not the most emotionally effective video game endings I've ever played through in my life. Now, I know it's a little cringe, a survival horror expert like myself getting the bad ending in one of these games, but to be fair, I did save just before the point of no return, and I could have easily just reloaded that and got a better ending, but I'm not at all sure that I want to. I don't know, this just feels like the right ending for everything I went through with this game, and beyond that, I think it perfectly sums up the simultaneous victory and futility of the battle itself. I mean, on one end, a country was able to beat back a vicious military force and protect its people, but on the other, to accomplish that, they essentially had to throw 300,000 young, capable men into a meat grinder. And I feel like if there was some kind of perfect narrative summary of all that, it would be the ending that I got. Alright, so now that we're done with the spoilers, I cannot suggest enthusiastically enough that you stop what you're doing right now and play CONSCRIPT. It may have some challenging hurdles that we are going to get into later, but without giving anything away, you need to beat this game. And I say that because when I did, I was met with one of the most emotional and sobering endings I've ever experienced before. The story may seem very light at first, only extending to Andre, his brother, and a fair few moments before they were conscripted, but what that seemingly small package culminates into, depending on what ending you get, might be one of the most effective conclusions of all time. But hey, I get it, you're not exactly ready to play through an entire ass game just to see if you end up enjoying the ending, so let's see if I can't sell you on its gameplay, or at the very least, let's say warn you about it. When I cover these newer survival horror games, I have a bit of a personal grading system. Some of them are old classic survival horror, the kind of stuff that wouldn't feel out of place on a PS1, games like Tormented Souls or Echoes of the Living, two titles that strive for that near one-to-one comparison with classic games in the genre like Resident Evil. Then we've got what I've taken to calling Survival Horror Plus, games that take the blueprints of the genre but don't limit themselves to just those blueprints. I'd say games like Crow Country, Alyssa, or You Will Die Here Tonight are good examples of this, which are titles that take 90% of the traits that you would expect from an old survival horror game but grow off of that platform and into some really unique places. And in that spectrum, I would say CONSCRIPT lives pretty hard on the survival horror plus side of things. I mean, all of the expected elements are here. Backtracking through large environments, looking for keys, puzzle solving, taking care not to overpack your limited inventory, constant risk-reward decisions, the ability to avoid combat. It's a veritable who's who of the kind of stuff you'd want to see in a game like this, and it all works in a way that stays incredibly authentic despite the radically different perspective and sprite-based nature of the game. There's just a lot more going on here as well. But before drowning in a sea of specifics, let's get the general stuff out of the way. As I'm sure you've already noticed by now, CONSCRIPT keeps a constantly slightly angled top-down perspective, which means there's no need for tank controls because from screen to screen the cardinal directions are always going to be the same. And I'd say at least as far as the controls are concerned, it feels pretty much perfect. Admittedly, Andre is going to move kind of slow by default, but you do have a run button. Although unlike your normal survival horror game, this button's going to eat up stamina, which is tracked by the bar in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, which is something you're going to want to get really good at managing, as it also ties into the combat in several really important ways. The first one is a dodge roll that I would say gives you a deceptively short amount of iframes. Essentially, you can be hit out of the roll, but only towards the very end of it. Meaning you can initiate a dodge while an attack is active and be totally fine, but if that animation gets more than 3/4 of the way done and you're still in range of the attack, you're going to take damage. I found a good rule of thumb is to get a slight run going just before the roll, which gives you just a hair of momentum that nets you a bit more distance. Sharing that meter are your melee attacks, which, aside from costing stamina, have another mechanic running simultaneously. You have to ready your melee hits like any other game in the genre by holding a trigger button, but unlike the rest of its peers, you can charge these attacks for more damage and a chance at putting the enemy into a pain state. With certain bad guys like the early game riflemen, you can just whack away with zero weight, but for anyone wearing any kind of body armor, you're definitely going to want each hit to be fully charged. Regardless of how you beat down Germans though, you're going to want to keep an eye on your melee weapon's condition because these things can break on you. Interestingly, shooting carries the same charge-based setup, only it doesn't cost you any stamina. The longer you have the trigger held down, the more accurate the shot, which in a game that makes you savor every last bullet, this is something you're really going to want to take advantage of. I do think there might be a bit more damage dealt by a shot with a full charge, but to be honest, it kind of feels like there's a random nature to this game that makes figuring that out kind of hard. This could just be a critical hit mechanic or something, but I feel like sometimes I'd be able to take an enemy down with 1 or 2 shots, but later that same enemy type might take double that. Now, I'm assuming we all know this, but the option to choose whether or not to engage in conflict is a key part of the genre, and CONSCRIPT of course allows for this kind of playstyle, but it goes a little deeper than just that. By that, I mean there's a stealth system, and if video game stealth is yin, its yang is definitely going to be the video game stealth kill. So if you wanted to, you could just sneak past patrolling Germans, avoiding a fight altogether, or you could stalk them down one by one and give them one of those never saw it coming kind of deaths. The latter being a great way to deal with a future threat and conserving weapon strength, as a stealth kill allows you to end a guy with just a single hit as opposed to the several it may have taken in a general combat scenario. Outside of shooting and smashing dudes up, but still tangentially related to it, we've got the game's bevy of inventory filling supplies. Of course, you have your staples like healing items, ammo, and weapons, but much like Resident Evil 3, we've got a handful of components that can be mixed together. Gunpowder and chemicals make bullets, and that same chemical concoction can be used on bandages to bump up their level of efficacy. Thanks to this and the general need to travel light due to limited space, you're going to be spending a lot of time in your inventory screen either cleaning things up or mixing things together, and I really got a kick out of that. I think it was the second Resident Evil game that made me start appreciating when a survival horror title lets its general gameplay mechanics spill over into the item screen. Being able to do stuff like mix gunpowder, make healing items, examine puzzle pieces for potential clues, and combine parts of a key item together, I really don't know why, but this sort of takes a bit of the video game kind of feel away from the inventory and brings it into the game world in a more cohesive way. But you could probably argue this next mechanic pulls in the opposite direction. Much to the joy of RE4 fans, CONSCRIPT has a persistent merchant character that'll camp in save rooms. This being a war zone, of course cigarettes are the accepted currency, and they can be found all over the place if you're looking around really good. With the merchant, you can buy melee weapons, a few helpful things like healing implements and gunpowder, but you can also upgrade your weapons. Now you might be thinking that something like this would throw off the game's intended difficulty, and normally I'd agree with you, but Jordan did a pretty amazing job of accounting for this. Not only are the items in the shop limited in supply, but between upgrading your guns and needing ammo, I found that I was still in a near constant state of just barely having enough of what I needed to continue. To my knowledge, I don't think I ever outright ran out of any one ammo type, but I always felt like I was just on the verge of doing that, which is a sign of a developer who really knows how to weaponize survival horror scarcity. Towards the end of the game, I was finally at a point where I had more than I could conceivably need to finish it, but once you've gotten to that point, you'll A, really be able to appreciate reaching some level of power fantasy, but more importantly B, you will have played the game long enough to understand that it doesn't really matter what you're packing, this is one hell of a challenging experience. When Jordan reached out to me on Twitter, he let me know that people were already coming back to him with criticisms of the game's limited inventory, so I went into it expecting that to be an issue, but surprisingly, I really didn't have any problems at all. Thinking back, I may have come across something important and had no room for it maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 times in my 15.5-hour playthrough. But to be fair to the people who were having this issue, there is a lot of stuff that you might want to keep on you in this game. I mean, between your melee weapon and potential backup if that one breaks, your guns, ammo, healing items, equipable stuff like armor, and whatever else you may come across, there's a hell of a lot competing for space in your precious few squares of inventory. I remember this being a real issue with Signalis back when I reviewed it. I felt like past the halfway point of the game, I was needing to trek back to an item box every other new room I discovered. Which, by the way, it is worth pointing out that the Signalis devs did eventually patch in a few fixes for that problem, and from what I hear, it really makes a difference. But here in CONSCRIPT, I conversely had almost no issues with my inventory. I mean, not only are new slots unlockable through the store and with upgrades you can find, but I think this game does a much better job of distributing its item boxes. Essentially, instead of having to head back to a save room for the singular purpose of dropping off excess nonsense and returning to where I was so I could pick something up, I could usually plan out a route to wherever I wanted to go and include a quick stop at an item box without a lot of out-of-the-way travel. But on top of that, I think I may have found a way to break the system a bit. At one point, you're going to come across body armor that's going to absorb damage for you, so what I would do is always keep that armor on me, and instead of needing to go through tons and tons of healing items, I would just use repair kits on the armor every so often when I made a quick pit stop to a save room. And since item boxes are regularly more convenient to get to in this game, I could just keep all my healing stuff and repair kits in the item box and top up on either durability or health exclusively in those rooms, which did a great job of negating my need to carry a whole lot of the stuff that people would probably normally want on them. But even if that's not the strategy you're looking for, I think mitigating this as an issue with good planning and organization is totally possible for the kind of person who'd be into playing something like this anyways. For those of you who don't play as much survival horror, I would imagine this is going to be a tough hill to get over, and if the inventory is a hill, I would call the rest of the game's difficulty a mountain sat atop 2 even larger mountains. Even with one-hit kills and stealth helping you out, the German forces invading France can absolutely beat you into the dirt. At first, I thought I was smart and I had figured out a bit of a process by dodge rolling and attacking in a certain order, but then enemies started literally kicking my ass when I pulled that on them. Sometimes an attack that usually causes a pain state just won't, which means that enemy could conceivably hit you as you recover from that attack and you're not able to move. I mean, sure, stealth can definitely help with this, but these guys aren't exactly thrilled about you bludgeoning their comrades to death within earshot, so it's really easy to alert an entire area if you're forced to take out a person in the right location. On the plus side, I did find out that you don't necessarily have to be behind a German to one-hit them, which makes things a little easier as you could just wait around a corner and smack them as they get within range, or even get right up in their face and take advantage of the amount of time it takes for them to notice you.
Jesus Christ, that's Jason Bourne.
As the game goes on, though, it's going to refresh the enemy roster with stronger foes that are going to take way more of a beating in an outright skirmish. It sort of feels like you're going through this constant process of getting just strong enough to not have to worry about combat, then getting introduced to a new bad guy and losing your newfound position at the top of the food chain. For those of you planning on checking out CONSCRIPT, first off, do not be afraid to select the infinite saves and checkpoint options when starting a new game. Trust me, you're not going to get an S rank on your first time through anyways, and second, make sure to play this game very slowly. When walking through a dark area, make sure to make periodic stops and just listen to the environment. The sound design here is quite literally incredible, and often the only way to tell if there's a threat waiting up ahead is just to be quiet for a second and listen for the sound of them breathing through their gas mask. Just like with the game's items, its difficulty will have you teetering on the verge of complete destruction throughout nearly the entire runtime, and I get the feeling this was Jordan's honest intent. He seems to really appreciate the inherent difficulty of this genre, and if his goal was to create a steroids-injected, superpowered version of that feature, bravo, because that is exactly what we ended up with. Now, those of you familiar with these kind of games, you'll know that there's a bit of a difficulty drop-off once you've dumped enough ammo into clearing out an area, but CONSCRIPT has a solution for that too. See, not only do you have to worry about the German soldiers patrolling these trenches, but the after effects of dealing with them. And if you've already played this game, you know exactly where this is headed. Just like the actual war CONSCRIPT is set in, rats here are a massive side effect of leaving dead bodies sitting out in the open. These dog-sized, annoying sons of bitches will converge on a body after a certain amount of time has passed, and they really do not appreciate your presence. If these things know you're around, they will chase you down like the meal that you are, and every single bite from one of them has the potential of inflicting poison, which reduces your max health. Now, on the plus side, you can use cans of fuel and a lighter to burn up the remains of your enemies, but this can be a huge chore considering the combination of a very limited inventory and how far you are from an item box. But I do have good news. By the time you watch this video, the PC version of the game should be patched with a number of features that I think will both solve the issue that I was about to spend 15 minutes ranting over and keep the level of challenge I think these rats were originally supposed to represent. Really important stuff like the amount of time it takes for them to aggro to you, how far they'll chase you down, your offensive options, and how often a bite will result in poison. Now, because of the nature of AAA storefronts, the console ports of the game may take a little longer to get this update, but that's not exactly something you, me, or Jordan can do much about. For now though, this is what I and seemingly most other people tend to agree as the most glaring issue that the game has, and it's really awesome seeing it being addressed so early on. Because for the entire time I played this game pre-patch, these things were a near constant annoyance. The only way I found to reliably take care of a rat-infested room was to either run through it at max speed every time, or to inch forward little by little so that I only aggroed one of them at a time, otherwise its friends would jump in, which essentially was an automatic game over or a restart. And since we're already heading in that direction, I think we need to go over what I think makes the game, at times, overly difficult. But before we do that, I want to make one very clear point. CONSCRIPT is an incredible survival horror game. It's innovative and fresh but familiar, challenging but satisfying. I mean, I absolutely loved my time with it, and I'm saying all of that right now because I'm about to put on the steel-toe boots and kick this game's teeth in. I just don't want you guys to think that all of the following complaints equal out to a negative experience overall. I definitely have my issues with certain elements, but I think instead of making the game bad per se, it's more like they kept CONSCRIPT from reaching the highs that I think it could have otherwise. Alright, let's get into this. Now, like I said before, this is a very tough playthrough, but I would say about 75% of that difficulty is the kind of stuff you would actually want in a survival horror game. The limited inventory, punishing combat, and of course the mental energy you're going to need to devote to puzzle solving and figuring out where to go next. And all of that, I would say, is masterfully handled here, but I think it's that 25% left over that accounts for 100% of my frustration. Now, we've already talked about the rats, and because this patch should be available before this video comes out, I'm actually omitting the half a page dedicated to that issue because I don't think it's going to represent the game correctly for the people who might use this video as a barometer as to whether or not they want to play CONSCRIPT. But lest you think this is me going soft on the game's developer, for those of you who, like me, had to suffer through them, suffice it to say they were without a doubt the most annoying game mechanic I've seen in quite some time. Now let's all be very, very thankful that they're getting fixed and move on. I'd say ranking a little lower on my list of priorities is the seemingly random nature of stealth. Sometimes I'd wait around a corner to stealth kill a bad guy and he'd somehow see me before I could get a hit off. So I'd exit the room, reset his position, wait around that same corner and attack around the same time, but this time he wouldn't have seen me. I guess the best way to put it is that I'm just never sure what will and will not alert a soldier. Sometimes I could run up to a group of two Germans facing each other and get stealth kills on both of them without either getting alerted, but then other times I'd knock out a guy in a seemingly empty area and aggro the hell out of someone who was in a completely different part of the room. Sometimes the enemies will get this eye that appears over their head as an indicator of whether or not you're alerting them, but sometimes they just get alerted without that eye ever appearing. Similarly, the fact that you need a full charge to perform a stealth kill makes it really easy to get yourself into a situation where you get spooked by the concept of them turning around early and release the button a microsecond before the charge is ready, and you end up alerting every living thing in the room with you. And since we're running on original MSX Metal Gear rules, enemy alert statuses and positions are all reset by exiting and re-entering a room, which sort of incentivized me to use that strategy a lot, and while very effective, I don't know, it just kind of felt like I was cheesing the game, which I would argue is justified just by how much the game gets off on punishing the player to what I would call an unnecessary degree. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm all for shaking up the act of returning to previous areas, but blocking off all of the convenient shortcuts and destroying all but one of the section's save rooms just sort of feels like you're being mean. This happens a lot. You'll get the layout of an area in your head and some enemy shelling will take place, and all of a sudden you need to trek through rat-infested side paths that you previously left alone, only to find out that the save room that used to be there isn't anymore. And I wouldn't find that to be so punishing if the game's map wasn't so damn selective with what it will and won't track. I mean, usually it's really good about marking roadblocks and points of interest in red, but sometimes it just chooses not to. I mean, if you're gonna take note of the bombed out sections of the first trench, why not do the same thing in the village where it's a confusing series of side streets that are filled with debris blocking your way? It's really damn easy to get lost in an area because you're using the in-game map to figure out a route, only to find there are several roadblocks on the way, so you end up going down the same dead-end roads over and over again, and with the rats and punishing enemy soldiers, that can be a very risky mistake to make. And the same thing goes with rooms filled with gas. Because areas in CONSCRIPT are so big, it can be really easy to forget where you have and haven't been, and if you're using the tried and true method of plotting your course based on the doors you haven't been through yet, it can be incredibly easy to walk right back into a room filled with mustard gas. I'm being dead serious when I say that there were several occasions while I was backtracking through an area and I would get this thought in my head like, what the fuck did I do to this guy to piss him off so bad? I mean, CONSCRIPT is already one of the most challenging survival horror experiences I've ever played before. You really don't need to take any extra steps in that direction. As a really good example, when you start the game off, your aim is relatively, I guess, stable for lack of a better word, but as time goes on, it starts to shake violently, and to be honest, I'm not sure if that's a result of Andre's adrenaline, his nerves getting the best of him, or something that I caused. But either way, it can be a huge nuisance. You'll have this perfect shot lined up, but because of his shaky hands, you'll completely miss and end up eating some unavoidable damage. I feel like this is the kind of mechanic that sounds much better on paper than it does in practice. I mean, a little bit of leniency would go a long way here, especially for a game with such a massive runtime. Sure, in some titles, maybe 11 or 12 hours isn't all that impressive, but for a survival horror game, that's like record-breaking. And you know, it'd be really nice if I didn't have to fist fight the damn thing for the entire playthrough. You know, maybe just half of it. Alright, so I understand that most of you still watching past this point may have gotten the idea that this game may not be worth your time based on all the bitching I just did, but I swear to you, nothing could be further from the truth. I don't want to mince words here. CONSCRIPT is flat out incredible. I was blown away at how much I enjoyed the damn game, and the fact that a single person made it all just furthers that feeling. Yes, it definitely has frustrating aspects to it, but you really can't beat the feeling of inching your way through a dark tunnel, listening out for the faint sound of an enemy somewhere up ahead in the darkness, or vaulting up over the protective walls of a trench to make a raid on a German base. This game made me feel more dread and excitement than some of the greatest entries in the genre, and that is truly saying something. I cannot recommend enough that you give this one a shot, and if the difficulty is an issue, there are of course easier modes available. With a relatively small amount of tweaking, I think this could become the best of the new wave of survival horror titles coming from independent developers, and based on my conversations with Jordan already, I get the feeling that he's very receptive to constructive criticism. If new survival horror had a tier list, CONSCRIPT would be damn near the top of it, and if its sole developer is down to mix around a few ones and zeros, it would easily take that #1 position for me. If you have even a passing appreciation for this type of strategy and planning-based horror, this is without a doubt a must-play. That being said, you are going to encounter a few issues that might give you the idea that the guy who made this hates you specifically. And to be fair, maybe he does. Alright, so I can admit I was a little critical when talking about CONSCRIPT's gameplay, but I can assure you none of that energy has followed me into its presentation. In a word, what you're looking at right now is just pure perfection. I mean, given the type of look this guy was trying to recreate, the fact that he was so successful with pixel art is nothing short of incredible. In fact, I wrote in my notes when I got about an hour into the game that I don't think a more accurate look could have been achieved with genuine modern 3D graphics. And I know you've heard this about 1 trillion times so far, but you do have to keep in mind that just one guy made all this. I can't believe how convincing the backgrounds are, either because of or despite their chunky low-resolution look, and the animations here are fluid as all hell. Winding up hits, reloading your weapons, even the enemies getting knocked on their asses. It all looks insanely realistic. I mean, this might be a bit of a morbid example, but look at how many frames there are in this crawling torso desperately seeking some kind of help animation. If you were searching for a downside, I guess you could mention the game's dark and dreary color palette, but given the setting, I think this was not only true to the source material, but appropriate as well. On the plus side, there are flashbacks to Andre's life before the war, and these brief segments offer a nice taste of color and unspoiled natural beauty, which is going to act as a nice palate cleanser for the atrocities and destruction you're about to return to. What especially stands out to me, though, is how well the game's developer was able to convey the sheer chaos of these big battles. You can see the massive shells flying overhead, and the screen shakes with all of the ensuing explosions. As you're running around, Germans and fellow soldiers alike are being taken out left and right, and I don't really know how to explain it. It just feels accurate to what you would imagine an actual war would be like. Interspersed between long swaths of gameplay, you'll come across cutscenes that'll break with the near constant top-down, slightly angled perspective, and I really got a kick out of these. There's only a few of them that actually animate past slow zooms or pans, but the ones that do remind me of the low-resolution look of the CGs you would find in PC games like StarCraft back when I was growing up. I mean, I'm sure even this limited animation took forever to actually create, but it would have been really cool to have seen a few more of these. It was also really interesting seeing so many pixelated versions of what I'm gonna assume are authentic war propaganda posters. And since I know there's at least one person out there who, like me, enjoys a good survival horror inventory screen, I just gotta say, damn, this is perfect. If I did have a single complaint, it would be that it takes a pretty long time to cycle through all the stuff in your item box, so a hit R1 to jump down a page option would have been nice, but from a purely visual standpoint, this is precisely what I want from an inventory in this genre. Like I've already mentioned, the game has no supernatural elements, instead choosing to stay well within the realm of realism and accuracy, and I do appreciate that. But there are a few standout moments when CONSCRIPT at least hints at things that venture outside those constraints, and it really gives the game an eerie feel. For example, the environments you'll explore typically stick to the dark, tattered trenches and battlefields of Verdun, but as you gain access to the lower levels of the German base, you'll notice things starting to creep towards an almost Silent Hill-esque level of design with lots of red lights, steel grates, and bottomless pits. In a similar vein, sometimes artillery fire will have this almost demonic sound to it, and I couldn't support that anymore if I tried. It sort of gives me the idea that I'm playing through someone's retelling of World War I, experiencing their personal interpretations of events along with the kind of imagery that such terror might have a person conjuring in their heads. And since we seem to have already dodge-rolled in that direction, I have to give an immense amount of praise to the game's sound design. Not so much the music, although that is great as well, but more the overall soundscape. Because with CONSCRIPT, it's the moments when no music is playing that tends to be the most effective. I mean, obviously, there are going to be situations where you'll have some kind of a backing track to your adventures, and they do tend to be memorable, but more often than not, it's just going to be you and the sounds of your environment. The falling rain, deep explosions, the report of far-off rifle fire, your feet sloshing through the mud. It's a genuine cornucopia of immersive sound effects, and when you head inside, things get even better. Sounds echo realistically on your environment, and the silence somehow makes it easier to mistake any errant noise as a German trooper coming up from behind you, which actually does happen quite a lot, so it's a justified kind of paranoia. Now sadly, I can admit that I played through maybe 75% of this game just using my speakers, but one night I was feeling extra atmospheric and slid my headphones on, and holy hell, what a difference. The sound of your footsteps as you transition from hard concrete to a surface made up of spent shells and debris, German soldiers waiting somewhere out there in the inky black distance, the reverb applied to things like reloads and gunshots. Listen, I'm gonna tell you this, and I'm being dead serious. You have to play this game with a good pair of headphones. I mean, not only is it way easier to identify threats that the screen hasn't revealed yet when you're wearing a nice pair of cans, but the immersion is just next level. And the same care was taken in giving the player great visual and auditory feedback for their actions. Hits sound like bone is crunching under the weight of your trench shovel, and the guns have some serious punch to them, along with a bit of screen shake if you leave that on in the options. Essentially what I'm trying to say is, everything that you do in this game has a video or audio effect that makes it feel as powerful or as significant as it should. Obviously, I had more than a few bits of criticism for CONSCRIPT's gameplay, but in terms of the presentation and sound design, it is a perfect 10. Now, there's a bit of a consensus here in the gaming scene that pixel-based graphics tend to age much more gracefully than their 3D counterparts, which is something I completely agree with. But I also think there's a certain level of detail with sprites that real-time 3D is just yet to be able to touch. Which I know is counterintuitive, but think of it like this. In between each pixel is an imaginary one that your brain is filling in. It's like these games give you everything you need to put together a much more fully realized scene in your head, and what's actually being displayed on your screen is just a facsimile meant to inspire you to imagine something even greater. And sure, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's just Jared reaching really damn far to justify the kind of graphics he grew up with and the stuff that he prefers personally. To which I can only respond with, I mean, yeah. Is this your first time watching one of my videos? Well guys, in conclusion, I have to say CONSCRIPT absolutely blew me away. There were without a doubt moments where it infuriated me and times where it felt like it was dragging just a little bit too much ass. But when I zoom out and look at the experience I had as a whole, it was indescribably cool. The game's developer obviously both understands and appreciates what makes a survival horror game difficult and was able to replicate it here, if not with just a little too much zeal. On the plus side though, what made this game, in my opinion, annoying at times could definitely be altered with updates, and it looks like our guy's already on the case, so I have no doubt that even more effort's gonna be made to at least meet us in the middle. But I'm gonna be honest here, even if this game never gets any more updates or never improves past this point, I'm still gonna count it among some of the most memorable experiences I've had with a video game. It both pays tribute to and successfully puts you into the conflict that it means to emulate, and if you were looking for a list of top 10 scariest places on Earth to set a horror game, well, the trenches of World War I are probably going to occupy 3 different spots on it. Conscript is emotionally engaging, mechanically unique, and visually incredible. I certainly have my complaints, and I would say I did a pretty good job laying them all out, but even with all that in mind, I can fully recommend that you jump at the chance to try this thing out. As of right now, the game's available on basically everything, so you really don't have an excuse not to get it. Actually, I have a flight back to America coming up pretty soon, and I'm probably going to grab it on the Switch just to have something terrifying to pay attention to outside of my very real and very irrational fear of flying. But I think that's enough out of me for one day. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Here's hoping I catch you in the next one, but until then, as usual, I'm Jared. And this is Avalanche Reviews. Hey, what's up, friends and close relatives? Thank you very much for being a G and making it all the way through the video. If you're new around here, you may not know that this content is propped up by the wildly awesome group of heroes that financially supported either here on YouTube via memberships or on Patreon. I know it may be getting old to hear, but these fine people are the reason I'm able to cover the games and topics that I want to, and they act like a thin line between me and putting out daily updates on Fortnite exploits. So do me one of two favors. Either lend your voice to the choir that is my awesome supporters, or thank them down in the comments for their selfless badassery. They deserve it. Alright guys, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here, but before I do, your hair looks great today. I just thought you needed to hear that.